countdown begins to India's grand G20. What does India's G20 presidency mean? Biggest global voices on one platform, the G20 Roundtable. Big focus on Newstrack.
Hello and welcome. Prime Minister Modi is pitching the G20 summit as the catalyst of a new global order. What will be India's role in this emerging new order? What are the geopolitical fault lines that can help India's rise? And what are the divisions which can hold India back? To talk about the most important foreign affairs issues of the moment, I am delighted to be joined on India Today's News Track by three super sharp global thinkers and strategists. Let me begin by introducing Ian Bremmer. Ian Bremmer is the president of the Eurasia Group. He's one of the world's top experts on global political risk. He's the author of Every Nation for Itself, Winners and Losers in a G0 World. Kishore Mehbubani is the former president of the United Nations Security Council. He's an acclaimed Singaporean diplomat, geopolitical consultant, and author of the book Has China Won? The Chinese Challenge to American Primacy. For an Indian point of view, I am joined by Samir Saran, president of the Observer Research Foundation. He's the co-author of the book The New World Disorder and the Indian Imperative. Ian, Kishore, Samir, welcome to this special G20 International Roundtable. I'm delighted that we could have all three of you together with your differing perspectives live at the same time. Ian Bremmer, I want to start by asking you about Chinese President Xi Jinping's decision to skip the G20 summit in the capital. He went to Johannesburg for the BRICS summit. He's giving the G20 a miss. Why do you think the Chinese president has decided he doesn't want to be at Prime Minister Modi's G20 Jamboree?
Look, first of all, delighted to join you and my esteemed colleagues today. I can't think of a better global platform to be talking about the G20 than this one. Xi Jinping and the Chinese government had let the Indian government know that they weren't going to come at least a month ago. So it's not news, even though it's headlines presently. Apparently, the Chinese government is saying it is in part, at least, because of difficulties in the bilateral relationship between China and India. In other words, this is not a sudden reaction to difficulties at home economically for China. As we've seen, the Chinese were very happy to be, from their perspective, headlining the BRICS summit. There were diplomatic gains. China was pushing hard to expand the BRICS. 6 countries invited. Argentina probably won't eventually join, but the others will. But it's certainly true that the Chinese prefer architecture that they feel like they have a handle on than one where they're one player of many. And in the case of the G20, specifically the G20 chaired by Modi and by India, that's less attractive to the Chinese. I don't think the fact that Xi Jinping and Putin are not going to be attending in person, in my view, does not significantly detract from the importance of this summit.
Samir Saran, from an Indian point of view, what do you think is the message? Xi Jinping, who's been described by some international authors as now having an emperor-like mindset, what's the message that you think he's sending to Prime Minister Modi and to India?
So, Rahul, thank you for having us, and I think it's a fantastic panel. Great to be with Ian and Kishore. I don't know what his message is, but let me tell you the message I'm getting. The message I'm taking from his no-show is that he feels that at the G20, he'll be a small man in a very big table of peers, and he would prefer to be in different company. And I think it reflects on his own place in the world, his own assessment of his place in the world today, that he feels less comfortable in big rooms such as the G20. I will also argue that it's also as much about their own economic troubles and the China project, which is today far more shaky than it was even at the peak of the pandemic. The expectations that 2023 would see China resurgent and dominating the world once again has not proved true. and we know that there's more to hide than to bear as far as the Chinese story is going. And finally, the political project, the redrawing of the power structures in Asia, the political project that Xi Jinping has invested into, faces a big roadblock, and that roadblock is India. And I agree with Ian that he would possibly see this G20 edition as being even less embracive of his worldview than any other edition, and he has chosen not to come.
Okay.
But like he mentioned, his loss. The G20 is a process now. It is not based on the final meeting of the leaders. I think what the Indian presidency has done remarkably well, it has made every day of the G20 presidency count. It has had a normative impact on other global processes. And the one day without Xi would possibly be a good day for the world.
Kishore Mehbubani, Xi Jinping has tried in his terms as president to be a player on the global stage. The G20 so far was seen as being important to him. In your reading, why is it that Xi is not coming? Does that in time to come then undermine the importance of the G20 as the primary platform where key international economic decisions were being taken so far?
Well, I'm sure there are lots of reasons. Firstly, thank you very much for including me, my friends, Ian Bremer and Samir Saran. Firstly, clearly, I think as Ian was also said, this is an indication that relations between China and India still remain very troubled. And I can tell you, by the way, that we in Southeast Asia are very worried about this, because for us, the future of Asia depends on good relations between China and India. And the better the relations are, the better for Southeast Asia. The more difficult the relations are, they're not so good for Southeast Asia. So that clearly is one indicator. But the second point here is that, I was in Bali last year, a few days before the G20 meeting in Bali, and President Jokowi, the host, had invited me for breakfast. And when he asked me at the breakfast and said, what should I try to accomplish at the G20 meeting in Bali a year ago? I said to him, President Jokowi, if you can organize a good meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden, the world will be very grateful to you because, at that time, as you know, relations between US and China were extremely bad, and there weren't even all these visits that have taken place since then of Blinken, Yellen, and so on and so forth. And I said to him, if you can organize a good meeting between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, the world will be grateful to you. And he said to me, don't worry, I've given them the best room in Bali for this meeting. And sure enough, as you know, President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden had a good meeting. The reason I tell that story is that there is now less urgency in a meeting between President Xi Jinping and Joe Biden. Relations have stabilized a bit. And also, by the way, the President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden will probably meet at the APEC summit in the United States. So there's another occasion for them to meet. But the third point I want to make here is that the G20 process will still remain important. I mean, let's be very clear about this. Of all the bodies in the world today, the most important is the G20 because it's the most representative global body. It's the only one that brings the North and the South together. And here, the most important point everyone should know about the G20 meetings is that this is a long process. This is part of a restructuring of the world order. We have to readjust the amount of power that the West has in the global scene and bring it down to a level commensurate with 12% of the world's population. And you need to increase the voice and influence of the global South. And here I must say the best thing that Prime Minister Modi is doing at the G20 meeting is that he wants to inject heavily the voice of the global South. I think that's the right thing to do in India.
Ian Bremer, share with our viewers your reading of China's economic situation at the moment. We saw unemployment amongst the youth hit 21% in June, after which data went black. One sense is that this is an economic wobble. The other is, with what's happened with Country Garden and other companies in the real estate sector, China could be facing its most serious economic crisis. What's your reading of just how bad the economic situation in China is, Ian?
Well, I think the situation is, of course, very troubling. And internally in China, they're spending a lot of time trying to figure out how much stimulus they should engage in without just creating more bubbles as they feel like they have historically. The approach is incremental. Xi Jinping is not surrounded by a bunch of reformers right now. And once he's made a decision, it takes an overwhelming amount of evidence to move him off of it. We saw that with the end of zero COVID. He sticks with it, he sticks with it, he sticks with it until it gets really bad. And then suddenly he ends it immediately. And so this economic slowdown is going to need to get a lot worse before the Chinese government is going to be prepared to act with a significant effort domestically. And so I think for the end of 2023, we're going to be continuing to ask this question. China's performance is going to be very low. But I also take on board the fact, and Prime Minister Modi said this in your interview with him on the G20, the fact that India, of course, has much better trajectory right now, has much higher growth right now than China does, and everyone's excited about it. It's a great shiny object. But India should have been making the policy moves they're making right now 40 years ago. Modi said that. China has been. So let's recognize that China is the second largest economy in the world. It has immense drive from a manufacturing perspective, new technologies, whether it's solar and critical minerals development or nuclear, biotech, AI, you name it, they are well ahead of India. And even though there are big problems in China and rule of law is essentially non-existent, so there are big risks around investing in China, it doesn't mean that suddenly they're less relevant and India is now critical on the global stage. You've got 40 years of history to make up for.
Sure. Samir, throughout India's tenure as the chair of the G20, China seems to have worked to obstruct and challenge India's leadership in some way or the other, from small things like opposing Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam to, on issues like Russia, Ukraine, climate change, energy policies. China in various ministerial meetings has been described as adopting obstructive tactics. Why do you think they've had this role, given the fact that in Bali there was a joint declaration, a joint communique that all countries agreed to, whereas in all our ministerial meetings, we've struggled because of this kind of obstructionist attitude in coming up with language which everyone agrees on?
Rahul, let's be clear, even in Indonesia, the only communique that came out was a leader's communique. Everything else was a chair statement, and it's no different in the Indian presidency. So we are following pretty much the same formula this year until now. We'll of course have to see whether we get a communique out when the leaders meet. The Indonesians could manage that, but as a European diplomat observed this morning in one of the papers, this time both sides, EU and Russia, EU and US on the one hand, and China and Russia on the other, seem to be more entrenched and far more ideological in the disagreement that currently is on a particular formulation on the conflict. So we did not see any communiques come out before the leaders' summit, even in the Indonesian presidency. But yes, you're right. The Chinese see this as a political moment to minimize progress under the Indian presidency, not realizing that in the Sherpa track, where all the ministerial and other engagement groups meet, most of the work that happens is on a shaping role. They don't have executive powers to enforce any progress either on climate or on gender or on health or on any other matter. These are only discussions and discursive forums where ideas for the future are taken to the forums that have the executive ability to implement them, like, for example, the COP28, which is happening in UAE in a few months' time. So whether you achieve a communique or not, you can achieve agreements amongst the most influential actors who can then take this back to the main forums where the matter will be mediated and discussed and agreed upon. So that's one part of the answer, Rahul. I just want to pick up something that Kishore mentioned, very important point. I think what India has done very well is that it has actually changed the nature and texture of the G20. I call it the people's G20. It has been taken to every nook and corner of the country, but more importantly, it has engaged a vast array of groups: students, academics, civil society actors, farmers, fisherwomen, all sorts of communities, a women-led growth model, a tech for development model. We have had a plethora of minds and and actors participate. Millions and millions of Indians have participated. They have brought their counterparts from other G20 countries into the discussions as well. G20 will never be the same again. It will never be this high table where only the high and mighty meet and discuss matters that are not relatable to people. India has brought people into the rooms. It has also made the rooms more relatable to issues that matter to people. And it has, of course, as Kishore rightly mentioned, it has made Global South a visible participant in the process of the G20. So I think that has been the single biggest contribution. Ian is right. China was this GDP 15 years ago. The Indian GDP size today is China 15 years ago. It's a 15-year gap between the two countries. We should not be over leveraging the India story, but we must realize that the India story is now on its way. It should have started 40 years ago. Maybe it is 40 years late, but the trajectory over the past few years gives me hope that in the next 15 to 18 years, we will pretty much be where China is today. And that would be a remarkable transformation that people that brilliant minds like Ian would have to contribute to, but also will also have to critically analyze because it is going to change the world. The movement from $3.5 to $15 trillion is going to absolutely create a new basis for managing much of what the world today is engaged with.
Kishore Mehbubani, I want to spend a moment on the mindset at this moment of the Chinese president. I want to quote to you what Alfred Wu, Associate Professor at the National University of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, said. He's describing Xi as being in an emperor mindset, who's expecting dignitaries to come to him, leaders from Germany, France, 4 senior Biden administration lieutenants have visited Beijing since China lifted COVID-19 controls. He's essentially saying he enjoys the high status when he's receiving guests at home. In the policy moves that Xi Jinping has made during COVID and post, what's the mindset that you're picking up at the moment?
Well, I can tell you that China is one of the most difficult countries to understand. And I've tried my best to understand it. And so, for example, if you take the short term, Ian Bremer is right. 2023 will be a difficult year for China for many reasons. Very difficult year. But what's going to happen in 2024, 2025? And I can tell you the conventional wisdom in the Western media is that, the China growth story is over, the people are tired, they're disillusioned. But there was also a story, by the way, in the Financial Times pointing out that the more dynamic sectors of China's economy continue to function very well, and China has overtaken Japan as the #1 exporter of cars. So that in China is complex story. There are and I'm really glad that India's economy is going to do very well. I share the optimism of Samir. It'd be wonderful for the world when India takes off too. But the global supply chain story again is something you cannot replicate what China has done overnight. It'll take a decade or more to do that. But your fundamental question is, what is the core thing in the Chinese mind? And there's a very simple answer. The core element in the Chinese mind is the century of humiliation that China suffered from 1842 to 1949. And if there's one psychological force that is thrusting China forward, it's the memories of the century of humiliation. And therefore, the Chinese have learned profound lessons as to why they got slapped by the West for 100 years effortlessly. And one of the lessons they learned, by the way, is that the reason why China collapsed is because it closed itself up, literally. So how does China come out? The answer is that the Chinese economy must remain open to the rest of the world.
But you heard what the US Commerce Secretary said during her visit to China recently, where she said because of the haphazard ad hoc economic policies, China is becoming increasingly uninvestable for international firms.
Well, I can tell you it's very simple. Go back to her statement 1 year from now Go back to her statement 2 years from now and then watch the investment figures. Now, it is true, by the way, that I think Ian probably has the latest data. The flow of new investment, foreign investment into China has slowed down for many reasons, COVID and other reasons. But if you look at the investment in China by companies inside China, are they reinvesting in China? And the answer is yes, they are. I mean, look at Tesla, okay? Tesla is one of the most successful companies in the world. What is Tesla doing? Tesla is betting on China. So, the Chinese story is very, very complicated. And it's a huge mistake to simplify it in any kind of way. But I can tell you also, and this is the one lesson I learned after studying China for 40 years or so, is never underestimate China. They have outperformed over 40 years against all expectations. It's safer to bet on a successful China, and then we have to deal with a
Okay.
stronger China. And how the question is asked, how do we deal with that stronger China?
Ian Bremmer, I'm very curious to know what you think about a comment made by someone you know well, Borje Brande, the president of the World Economic Forum. He was at the Business Today India at 100 summit recently, and in an interview I did with him, he said that in the next 10 years, the Indian economy will be $10 trillion, and he sees the emergence of a new world order, which will be defined by what he called the G3. The US, China, and India. Now, your book is G0, which is about each country pulling for itself. And in that context, I wonder what you think of Borge Brande's comments about a G3.
Well, I'll get to that. I want to quickly offer a rejoinder to what my friend Kishore was just saying, which is that, of course, we don't want to simplify the Chinese economy, but we do want to go back to what Secretary Raimondo just said in another year, 2 years, 3 years, about how many people believe that China is increasingly uninvestable because Chinese labor, remember, the last 40 years of extraordinary Chinese growth came because China had unprecedented, inexpensive, productive labor that was essential. It became the factory of the world. That is no longer the case. Chinese labor is more expensive than Mexican labor today, in part because of the extraordinary growth. Chinese domestic competition is much more challenging in a legal environment that is not markedly more open. That's making Western firms less interested. And the Chinese demographic situation is appallingly bad for a middle income country. I mean, you imagine it in South Korea or Japan, but not for a country that's only making $12,000 per capita. So all of these things are going to make China more challenging in terms of their growth story for the next 3, 5, 10 years, even if the US-China relationship remains relatively calm and steady. And that is a big assumption going forward. So I am more concerned than I have been for a long term for where China is going. That does play into my view of whether or not we're heading into a G3. I think the world is more complicated than that. We've been talking about the G20 on today's show, but of course, at the same time as the G20, which is the most important in the sense of being most inclusive among the largest countries out there, but the most impactful summits increasingly are the G7. And that's because the United States leads it. It is more cohesive. It is more coordinated. And these countries are increasingly sharing a worldview. That means that the BRICS, with China much more comfortable attending it, they're trying to make that a different order that has the Chinese and the global South together. And certainly I see an environment that's going to be much more complicated than G3. I see one where the Americans are dominating the security order that feels like a G1 still, with a bunch of rogues that don't participate. I think the India-US relationship and the new architecture in Asia around the Quad is a big piece of that. I think that economically, which is what Borge is talking about, There will probably be something that is more G3 like, but also with the EU as a principal player. I'm a little surprised that he didn't include the EU in that formulation, especially given where the WEF is headquartered. And because I see it as being more cohesive and coordinated over time, not less. But then there's a technology order, a digital order, and it's not clear that that's a G anything. It may well be a technopolar order where technology companies, not governments, are actually driving outcomes, and that's a dangerous geopolitical development. So, I mean, I don't think the G0 is going to persist for long, but I think what replaces it is a lot more nuanced and complex than the idea of a G3.
Samir Saran, everyone watching at this moment would be delighted with the idea that there's a G3 emerging, but then they'd advise caution and say, let's not get carried away by the hype, as India often tends to overpromise and underdeliver. In your reading of the situation, could Borge be right about the emergence in the next 10 years of a new world order defined by the G3? Or was he just pandering to the domestic Indian constituency, given that that's where he was speaking, which is why, as Ian mentioned, he left Europe out of that formulation?
The good thing about India, Rahul, is that you can make an assertion about India that is true, and the opposite is also equally true. So I think perhaps what we really need to be thinking about is the big question that Ian has posed before all of us. That could we have all of this, we still have a G0 world, because no one is really in control. And I think it's probably going to be a sectoral and domain focused influence of different actors at different points of time. But collectively, are we still going to see what my book promises, a new world disorder? And I think that's the big question, that a G0 world and a G3 world are not contradictory. You could have a G0 world and still have 4 or 5 big countries with their influence operations in different domains and sectors. And I think we are probably going to see a kaleidoscope of all of that play out in the coming decade. I just want to reiterate one point, and I agree with Kishore. It's a complex country. It's not easy to make pronouncements, but Ian is right. An old China, an aging China, a China without sufficient people, with costly labor, is not the China of the previous 2.5 decades. And I think that's the story that's playing out in China. That can an aging China have the same resilience and resurgence that it has remarkably shown in its 4 decades of growth in the future? Can we project that into the future? And I think that's the big if. And to me, India is certainly a bright spot, contributing 15% of growth this year, 15% of global growth with a GDP that's close to 5% global GDP. So we are certainly a bright spot, but we require to be relentless in investing in infrastructure, industry, opening up, and making ourselves investable. So I think the India story is, which lies ahead, is about continuously doing more, doing it better, doing it faster, and doing the simple things right. We don't have to be complex. We need the roads and the bridges and the ports and sensible laws, and we are there. But we need to do this with single-minded focus in the days ahead. We could be G3. We could certainly be part of any grouping that organizes the world in the future. EU is a big actor. EU will be a partner with India. Both of us don't want the G2 world. Both of us want a world where we should be able to make alignments based on interest and values and what suits us. So I think the EU is difficult to ignore and would be part of any formulation for the future.
Okay, so both Ian and Samir pushing back against Kishore Mehbubani's idea that China will bounce back, to say that the factors that propelled China's growth over the past 4 decades are different from the world internally and externally. An aging population, smaller workforce, the fact that with a China plus one pivot, a lot of companies now wanting to look outside China and build resilience in their value chains, and therefore a lot of estimates now say that China may possibly never become the #1 economy. Even if it does, it will happen at a much later stage than was initially being predicted. Kishore Mehbubani, you've always been, especially from an Indian point of view, very soft on China and very tough on India.
Well, the number one, I would say that what makes me unusual is that I'm bullish on both India and China, and people often make a choice. Now, the story on China, all you have to do is go back and read what the Anglo-Saxon media told you 10 years ago about how the China story is over. It's a constant theme. It's a constant theme.
You don't think this time is different because of the factors that Ian just mentioned?
Well, there are answers to every one of the points you made. Now, let me give you a simple answer. Let me give you a simple answer. China is producing the largest number of robots in the world. The largest number. Now, that's clearly an answer that they saw long time ago to the fact that the labor force is diminishing. China is also producing the largest number of graduates in STEM, science, technology, right? And China has surpassed everyone's expectations. When the United States cut off exploration on space with China, how did China perform? It set up its own international space station. I'm only saying this, by the way. If China performs as badly as Ian says it is going to perform, we have nothing to worry. China, the story is over. But what happens if my predictions come true? And we'll find out in 5 to 10 years. And China really becomes the number one economy in the world, then it's a different world. And we have to psychologically consider what that kind of world is. And by the way, surprisingly, I agree with Jan Bremer that it won't be a G3 world. It'll be a very complex world. There'll be many shapes and nuances, lots of players, including, by the way, ASEAN in Southeast Asia, including the African Union. And I can tell you Russia will play a role too. So it'll be a very complex world. And the simple black and white divisions that we make will no longer operate in the world. And I must say, the one thing I have to disagree with Ian Bremer is about the G7. It's a sunset organization. It represents the past. It's a postcard from the past. People will laugh at the G7 10 years from now when they continue meeting. Come on, let's get serious. The world has changed fundamentally. The reason why my book, The Asian 21st Century, has been downloaded 3.2 million times in 160 countries is because the world is psychologically preparing for the Asian century, which includes India in a very big way.
Ian Bremer,
That's the story.
there's a pitch for downloading the book, but that aside, I want to give you a moment to respond to the idea of the G7 being a sunset platform, that the best days of G7 are behind them, and respond to Kishore Mehbubani's point about if all the prognosis about China's doom is wrong, then in the next 5 to 10 years, the world will be looking at a very different kind of world order, which will be led and determined by China, he says.
I mean, it is surprising to see the level of willingness of Kishore to accept uncertainty around China, and I agree with him on that, and have such certainty around the idea that the G7 is history. I don't know where you get that level of certainty and lack of nuance about the United States and the core allies among the advanced industrial democracies. I'm impressed with that level of confidence. I just don't know where it comes from. I don't know that the G7 is history. I think the challenges that China faces and that the United States, as the world's largest economy, face are very different. The Chinese challenges are overwhelmingly about their economic system, about the stage of globalization, about their demographics, about state capitalism and its efficiency. The challenges in the United States are not economic challenges. They are political challenges, and they are perhaps equally dangerous and grave as China's economic challenges. It's not clear that the United States has a sustainable representative democracy. It's not clear that its citizens believe in America's political system or its allies believe in America's political system, the way it's not clear that Chinese believe in the Chinese economic system going forward. And I think that that's going to be the biggest question about the strength of the G7. is whether the Americans are prepared to continue to play a leadership role. What kind of outcome do we see from the 2024 US election, which is a train wreck waiting to happen and with very few signs of pushback domestically? So, I mean, clearly, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, something we haven't discussed yet, but that's been occupying the G7 very strongly and not the G20 over the last 500 days, you have an enormous level of leadership and coordination among all of those allies. And it's even bringing Asian allies closer to the G7, closer to NATO as a consequence. Will that still be true in another 2 years? There's a huge uncertainty there, easily as big as the uncertainty as China's economic performance going forward. And I think we just don't know. I think we have reasons to be skeptical about the future trajectory of the G7. They are largely political, and they are similar in scope to the reasons we have to be skeptical about China's economic development. In both cases, big things need to change if we want to continue to see success. And right now, we're not seeing any assessment in the US political system or in the Chinese economic system that those big changes are coming.
Let's spend a moment on the Russia-Ukraine war, Samir, because when we interviewed the Prime Minister for Business Today, one of the things he said is that, there are other issues on which there can be convergence. Amitabh Khan, the G20 Sherpa, said, let's focus on what unites us, not what divides us. However, the German Sherpa for the G20 has said, how can you have a G20 without spending substantial time, energy and effort talking about the Russia-Ukraine war? Do you see the dynamic playing out over the Russia-Ukraine war derail any attempt India may make to have a joint communique, to have tangible outcomes at the end of the G20 leaders summit? How should India be playing it on the back of the Sherpas meeting and right before the leader summit begins?
Look, Rahul, as a host and as a platform provider for the G20, India has to, in many ways, find the sweet spot that allows all participants to feel that their viewpoint has been captured and reflected in the final communique, if it is to be signed by all. And here, it will have to use its persuasive powers to come up with a wording or a draft that works for all. Having said that, I think the G20, where the biggest countries sit, is a platform that over the years has confronted a few crises, right? It was shaped during the crisis. In many ways, the G20 was elevated to a leaders' summit in the midst of a crisis. And anything that impacts the globe, the G20 will have to deal with. So I think it's a fair thing to say that while it was not designed to be responding to a crisis such as the one that is unfolding in Ukraine, it has not been impervious to the implications of that conflict. And countries that are affected and countries that are indeed proximate to that conflict are going to be viewing the world and issues through that particular prism. And we have had to face those headwinds. I think India has done pretty well, as possibly Ian also acknowledged, that despite many issues and urgent and emotive interventions on this subject by many European and interlocutors from the Atlantic system, we have been able to still focus on questions of development, growth, climate, and other important issues. So the presidency has done well to take forward the discussions on matters that are important to everyone. It has, of course, also grappled with finding that wording that will that will work with both parties or both sides by describing the conflict in the communique and in various other statements. I hope we'll be able to find a resolution on that particular front and have a communique that comes out, because to me, as we head into that summit, this particular presidency has used the bully pulpit to shine a torch on what matters to 7 billion people who have not yet been served by global governments. In the world, as the globalization has served 1 billion people well, many Indian and Chinese amongst them, the next 7 billion need to be served. G20 is the best forum to do it. And I think the last 10 months of the G20 presidency have been spent on serving these 7 billion. One short point, Rahul, I must come in. I think the challenges for democracies like US and India is to create political convergence among societies so that the big national projects can be taken forward. Uh, the challenge for countries like China is to allow diversity and heterogeneity in their leadership. I think one of the biggest challenges to China's resilience is not just aging, but it's also the small coterie that is now running China under Xi Jinping. The Communist Party of China was able to create a diversity of views in their standing committees and in their leadership. The Chinese have eliminated that. The fragility of a single point of thinking is what is now playing out in China. I think Ian mentioned the COVID reopening or the post-COVID reopening of the economy, but you see the missteps coming in
Sure.
precisely because no one brings in a different thinking into that room where the emperor sits. And the emperor today has a lonely cabinet.
Interesting. Ian Bremmer, the Economist Intelligence Unit, had a piece out which basically spoke of how economic agreement is becoming increasingly difficult for the G20, hamstrung as it is by geopolitical differences, and how the failure to issue a declaration would suggest that the G20 could be losing viability going into the future as the preeminent organization of the world. Would you buy that? How much emphasis would you lay on the need for India as president to produce a communique at the end of these deliberations?
Look, obviously, it's important to show that the summit is a success, but I don't think that's the only metric that we judge it by. I agree with Samir that it is essential that the 7 billion people that have not been served by global governance and architecture have spokespeople that are able to drive their interests and force them on the global agenda. And India's chairmanship of the G20 is a significant step in that direction. So in that regard, the issues that are being driven by the Indian government are very important on financing, for example, for climate change. And I see the G20 as potentially more impactful on that than this year's COP summit in Abu Dhabi because of the controversy around it. Lots of other issues in that regard. But one thing we have not mentioned, again, I mentioned Russia, Ukraine briefly, and of course, Modi doesn't want to discuss it, and he says that's only driving countries apart. It's true, but let's be clear. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is not important so much because of Ukraine for the G20. It's important because it's the first time that one of the G20 nations has been made into a rogue by the entire G7. Saudi Arabia approximated that, came close to that, much smaller economy and much less holistic willingness to toss them out after the Khashoggi incident. This is a wholly different concept. This is the G7 taking, in other words, a big component of the G20 saying one of your members is led by a war criminal and we can no longer work with them. And I agree that Russia is still going to be, as Kishore said, an important country in the world. It's just going to be an important country that is seen as a war criminal. That's a real problem for the G20. That's a real problem for the development of the global economy. I mean, for gas flows, for food, for fertilizer. There's a deal that they're trying to get back on the table today with Turkey, unlikely to occur. And so the interference of geopolitical trends, of which the biggest near-term crisis has been the Russian invasion, but there are many, many more, with economic development is a principal spanner in the works of how we can continue to drive cooperation in the face of really big global challenges. You need global responses, but nobody believes that we have effective global responses right now, not to COVID, not to climate, not to technology, not to the Russia war. And that's a very, very principal challenge, not just for the G20.
I'm running out of time on this roundtable, but I want to go across for one final question each. And Kishore Mehbubani, I'll start with you. One of Prime Minister Modi's big attempts has been to position India as the voice of the global south during his G20 presidency. Now, China, over the past several years, has been working towards emerging as the leader of the global south. Is this where an India-China contestation is now shaping up, where India, through its efforts to onboard the African Union as a permanent member of the G20, is trying to give the global south a voice, whereas China sees itself as the natural leader of the global south. How do you see this play out?
Well, I think it's good that both China and India are competing to be leaders of the global south, because the voice of the global south, as Samir said very clearly earlier, has not been heard. And you asked about Ukraine earlier. You interviewed Prime Minister Modi, and I remember in the interview you asked Prime Minister Modi, "What are you going to do about Ukraine?" And what was Prime Minister Modi's response? He says, "Why do you mention Ukraine only? Aren't there wars in Syria? Aren't there wars in Libya? Aren't there wars in other parts of the world? Why do you focus on one war?" And he said, this is where, Foreign Minister Jaishankar was very wise. He said, Europe thinks that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems. That's why it's good that India is vying for leadership of the global south, because there's so many more issues than Ukraine in the world. Yes, Ukraine is important, but come on, 88% of the world's population lives outside the West, and 85% of the world's population has not imposed sanctions on Russia.
Interesting. I want to go to Samir on the issue of the BRICS and the SCO. India at this moment is in this position where it's president of the G20, is a key part of the Quad, is furthering ties with the United States, and yet is a member of the SCO, which obviously they didn't put the kind of soul into, because the SCO summit this year was held virtually by India. We're part of BRICS, which has now been expanded. At some point in time, Samir, do you see India having to choose between, say, being a part of the Quad, being a part of the G20, and wanting to continue playing a role in the SCO or BRICS, which China clearly wants to dominate and set the agenda for?
So, Rahul, I want to come to that question. It's a great question. Let me answer that. But before that, I just want to add something to points made both by Ian and Kishore. Let's put a counterfactual here. Just a thought, and I'll leave it there. Let us all come up with our own answers. If the invasion of Iraq by George Bush Jr. had taken place a few years ago, and the leaders summit of the G20 was already underway. Actually, when the invasion took place, G20 at the leaders level did not exist. But if it had happened in the last few years, how would George Bush have been treated by the G20? And that's just a thought we should all process. How would the world have responded to a blatantly unfair war imposed on proud people, the destruction of democracy? And that's something we must think about. Could we have responded in the same way? And if we did, then perhaps we are in the right direction. If we would have responded differently, then we are just letting our biases play out. That's just one thought, Rahul. On the BRICS and SCO, on the BRICS, and both of them are very different organizations. SCO, we are a late joiner, and I think simply because of our presence in a particular region, we need to be in the tent rather than outside of the tent. What SCO does could have implications on our security and on our economic prospects. We need to be within that grouping, A, to moderate it, B, to prevent any harms coming towards us, and C, to ensure that there is sensible, rational conversations in that particular grouping. BRICS, for that matter, BRICS is another matter altogether. We are a founding member, and let me confirm to you that on that table, when expansion was being discussed, the largest list of countries that was proposed by any country was by India. India wanted the largest number of new entrants, contrary to popular perceptions. And the idea of bringing more people in was to actually strengthen the grouping in a manner in which the right kind of actors with resources and means could participate,
Okay.
or those sit on certain important geographies could contribute. And if you look at the new entrants, you would not find many who would not be equally comfortable with the G7 as they are with the others in the BRICS grouping. So the countries who have come in are not polarizing figures. or polarizing countries. They are all countries who are going to contribute to the bridging role that these emerging geographies must play. They are right after the Indian mold, where we believe that we need to be in as many groups as possible, because there are going to be some countries, including the US, including India, including a few others like China and Japan and others, who will have to be in multiple smaller arrangements so that we have a cohesive, larger world order.
Okay, last question, Ian Bremmer. I interviewed Fareed Zakaria a couple of days ago, and one of the things he said about American politics is that no matter who wins, America is headed most certainly into a state of political crisis. He spoke of how if Donald Trump wins or loses, there is likely to be chaos. So given where you sit, could you share with our viewers your reading of what's most likely to happen in America, putting on your risk hat right now?
Look, I mentioned that no one's looking forward to this election, aside from perhaps America's adversaries. It is very likely that this is Biden versus Trump redux, the two incredibly old and also pretty unpopular leaders. And right now they're polling about even. The latest polls show 45 to 46 if Biden versus Trump, which means that we have no idea who would actually win. Trump is more unpopular with independents. We also know that we have 91 indictments against a twice impeached and twice acquitted former President Trump. Everything about this election that is negative is unprecedented in U.S. history. And no matter who wins the election, the losers and the losing side is going to feel this time around that the election is illegitimate. Meaning, if Trump wins, the Biden supporters believe that he shouldn't even be allowed to run, given the crimes that they believe he's committed. If Biden wins, Trump, of course, will rally his supporters yet again to say this was stolen, this was rigged, and he's going to be facing potential jail time. This is all horrible for the United States and, of course, for those that rely on the United States. My final point is that India, at least India, is one country that we know has a trajectory of good and improving relations with both Trump and Biden. So at the bilateral level, at least as long as Modi is there, it does seem like the U.S. election will have less impact on India than it will on many other countries and many other democracies around the world.
Ian Bremmer from New York, Kishore Mehbubani from Singapore, and Samir Saran from New Delhi for lighting up this G20 International Roundtable with the depth of your insights, the breadth of your perspective. Thank you very much. India is aiming big with the G20 summit, so we thought the India Today group should do the same, set up a high-quality international roundtable, and I think the kind of insights you've heard over the past hour would be very difficult to find on any Indian or, for that matter, international broadcast. So thank you to our guests for making this so special. I'm slipping into a break. We'll have more for you on the other side. Stay with us.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.